Assistant Executive Director with the Learning Network here at AASA, and it is my privilege to provide, as we do each month, an excellent thought leader in the field of education for our members. We look forward to providing high-quality professional learning for all of our members, especially those who are involved in the AASA Learning 2025 network of demonstration systems. This initiative, as you know, calls for holistic redesign of public education systems, and it's really the foundational work for our National Commission's student-centered, equity-focused, future-driven education plans. The work has been focused on dealing with the whole learner. We have certainly worked to make sure that no learner feels marginalized and that we provide the kind of support that help our schools and our school districts focus on the future. To do that, we provide monthly opportunities for our members, whether in person or virtually, to be exposed to our national thought leaders. And I am so pleased today to introduce to some and certainly to reacquaint others with Dr. Horacio Sanchez. Some of you may know him as a national speaker and author. He's an educational consultant to many organizations that are focused on improving formal education. He's recognized as one of the nation's leading authorities on resiliency and applied neuroscience. His expertise helps schools overcome the impact of poverty, to help improve the school climate, engage in brain-based instruction, and address issues related to implicit bias. He's the author of best-selling books, The Education Revolution and The Poverty Problem. The Yale Center for Educational Improvement says his new book, Unlocking School Bias, is simply brilliant. And he also has another new book that he'll probably reference during our time together today. He chose for our time together, and we had many topics to explore, the secret to school climate. No matter where you are in the United States, we're all concerned about school climate. And most people are really unaware, as he and I discussed in our first of many conversations, that most people are unaware that we often influence others' chemical equilibrium and how they influence us. We're unaware because the process happens in 200 milliseconds or less, making it completely subconscious. And conscious thought takes us about maybe 600 milliseconds. 600 milliseconds is what he told me. So if 600 milliseconds is for consciousness, 200 milliseconds is for subconscious, then I might be in trouble many times. But today he's going to talk about the secret to school climate, and he wants to, during our conversation together, and it will be a conversation, help us understand what the pre-attentional system is hardwired to focus on. So of course, we'll learn something today about that. We'll learn how simple behavioral modifications can dramatically influence the emotional brain, the amygdala, and improve our social interactions. And of course, school climate is based on social interactions. We'll realize how disproportionate patterns in the school environment can influence perceptions and behaviors, and recognize how those patterns in society also influence our thoughts and actions, and how we can positively influence the brain to improve school climate. Dr. Sanchez has a new book, Unlocking School Bias, which is due to release on March 14th, 2025. And I did tell him that that's Pi Day, so it's a day for learning. We're excited. We'll remember that it's being released on Pi Day 2025, and it will cover some of the information in this session. So I know you'll be intrigued. I know you will definitely want to engage with that new book. So I'm pleased to introduce him to you and to share a few moments of his precious time so that we can understand better the secret to school climate. Dr. Sanchez, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today. And we are looking forward to this conversation. One of many we've had, except we'll share this one with our members. So thank you again for being here. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that subconscious brain system. When you told me about the 200 milliseconds, I was really intrigued by that because I was thinking, I tried to break it down and think about how often are we responding to our subconscious. And the more you and I talked about it, the more intrigued I was. Why should we be concerned about the subconscious brain system versus the conscious? Why should we be concerned about that? And how does that play into our daily interactions?
Okay. Right now, if I were to ask you, how does a thought develop? You would probably think your experiences, your prior knowledge, and then what's happening in your environment that's influencing the creation of that thought. And if you did an action, you would have two options right on the surface. You would say, okay, my action is based on a thoughtful decision based on experience, what I know in the situation I'm in, or an emotional decision based on what had happened in my brain because I became emotional and my reaction at the moment. So that's how we think about thought and action. So subconscious thought occurs at 200 milliseconds or less. Conscious thought occurs at 600 milliseconds or less. So what we now know is since subconscious thoughts already occurred, it seems to influence thoughts and actions. Why is this a big deal? Well, the first big deal is this. Your subconscious brain is designed to focus on certain things, hardwired, and as a result, it influences your chemistry and reactions. And sometimes it can produce a thought that's actually in contradiction to your thoughts and values. So now backtrack and imagine this. Most of the time you think you have a thought, and it's definitely because of what you're thinking and it's a complete outcome. And what we now know is people are influenced by things they don't know they're being influenced by, and it's truly influencing their thoughts and action. But since it's happening so fast, they're completely unaware. Then research came and found out a very interesting thing. If you learn what the brain does to process subconsciously, you become some kind more aware. And sometimes you can even recognize things. But more importantly, if you know how it goes about it, you can actually put in some kinds of safeguards to make sure that there's less likelihood that your thoughts and actions go against your value system. And I think everybody out there would want to make sure their thoughts and values don't go against their value systems.
So I'm intrigued by that. So give me an example, if you can, I'm sure you can, of what might work. What is it that might be influencing me subconsciously that does go against my values and that I'm completely unaware of it? Give me an example of that.
Okay, first let's unpack the system. Okay, first thing is you have a preattentional system. So there's certain things we know you're going to look at automatically, regardless of where you are, where you're born, race, culture, gender, just hardwired into the brain. So we are hardwired to look at emotions. So let me give you an example, facial expressions. Preattention says that our brain has done this so long that it's become so efficient that it does it so fast that you're unaware, but the implications are huge. This experiment had a person standing up and they're looking at a dot on the wall. They're wearing these special glasses that measure pupil dilation. When you focus, your pupil dilation changes. So we know externally the focus happens. The person's also hooked up to fMRI so we can see what's happening in the brain. They tell the person, focus on the dot. They put 2 participants 15 degrees on their peripheral. The participants are instructed to make a very quick emotional expression, smile, frown, furrow their brow, something very quick. And that's all they're supposed to do. The person's looking at the dot, the people are on their peripheral. The second that the person makes any expression, we see pupil dilation changes. That means the brain focused on it, even though the person didn't see it. But here's what happens in the brain. We saw mirror neurons activate. Mirror neurons mirror what they just saw. So if the person was making a smile, motor neurons in the brain activated like you're smiling. All emotions carry a chemical signature. So the chemical signature releases something influencing your mood. As a result, a smile will make you a little bit happier and a frown will make you a little less happier. But this all happened without you knowing. Then they had the people do it at the same exact time. And they found the brain did both. And he said, how can the brain do both if they did the same time and the people at your peripheral? Your eye system has a thing called microsarcades. It's the largest fast movement of your eyes in scanning the environment all the time. So one of the things these microsarcades do is scan for facial expressions. So it spotted them both because it moves so fast. And so we'll never miss it, to the point that even if it happens way on your peripheral and you don't even know, even if it happens with a person's profile, you will still identify it. So they moved the participants to 30 degrees, made no difference. Now, here's what we now know. You've heard of like mean cities and happy cities. I use this illustration all the time because I've lived in mean cities and I've lived in happy cities. And let me tell you the difference. Walk down the street of a mean city and everybody's got like walking fast, got a scowl on their brow or looking down or just making sure they don't do anything so anybody will think that they're weak. And what happens is that becomes the tenor of the city. Why is it becoming the tenor of the city? Because everyone's doing it and every person you pass, even if they're on your peripheral, is impacting you chemically. They're frowning. Your brain just triggered it, saw it, you just passed them. You didn't think you triggered it and saw it, but the minute you passed them, your brain saw them, your brain scanned them, and it influenced your chemistry. Now think about passing 100 people who look really tough and pissed off. So that's why you see visitors go to those kind of cities and they're smiling and everybody knows they're visitors because they're smiling. But have the visitors stick around for about a week, guess what happens? They stop smiling. But you've been to those other places where it's always 70 degrees and everybody's walking around, exercising and happy, and you go there and you feel happier over time. And it seems to help that way. But also people get used to things and you find some people from mean cities go to places like that and they hate it because it's something so different initially. They'll have to get used to it. But what's the implication on school climate? They've done experiments now and they have kids go to schools. And one of the profile schools is this really homogeneous, pretty affluent school. It's still a public school. Kids get there, they're goofing around, they're seeing their friends, they're happy, they're just, the brain scans that they're wearing says what? That their brain is getting positively influenced, even though they go to school. And by first period, their brain is completely capable of learning. But they've also tracking some kids that are going to schools that are a little bit less happy. It's an inner city, highly impoverished. A lot of kids are lethargic. Every time a kid passes the lethargic kid, it influences their brain and loses energy. They have kids that look anxious. Every kid they pass that's anxious, actually, when mirror neurons activate, it mirrors all the things that triggers anxiety and the kids' anxiety levels. Then they have kids who look really angry and aggressive. And that also happens. All this chemical upheaval is happening. And by the time this student gets to first period, their brains are incapable of learning. So here's something we know about school climate that most people don't know. The quality and the quantity of the emotions of people around you determine your school climate. Have you ever been to a school and the person walks in, they go, I can tell a good school from a bad school instantaneously. Well, of course you can. You know what happens in a good school? You're passing a lot of people who are happy to be there, and it uplifts you. And you know, this is a great place to be. What happens in a school where nobody wants to be at? You get that feeling also chemically. So that's why the pre-attentional system is critical, because it's impacting people at all times.
That is, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And I appreciate the examples so much, because you do walk into a place, even a store, where I have a favorite, if there is such a thing, a favorite grocery store. So there's some stores I'll shop in, and the lighting is poor. The staff seems less friendly to see you, less happy to see you. Um, it feels like drudgery. I already hate grocery shopping anyway. So I walk in there and I'm like, oh my gosh, this does not do anything to lift my spirits. Now the prices may be better, but I don't get a good feeling from being there. And then there's another store that I tend to choose. The lighting is great. From the parking lot to the time you get to the register, people are friendly. How can I help you? It's a beautiful day today. We've got, I mean, it's like a selling job. Everything aesthetically is inviting. And we see the same thing in schools. So your
Right.
example is excellent. And unfortunately, I've had that experience of going into buildings and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm I feel a heaviness when I walk in. I feel a heaviness when I leave. And then there are other places I go in and it feels just like the grocery store I tend to support. It is happy, there's light, there are drawings, it's just more inviting. And so you're saying to me, in my layman's terms, that it is clearly the environment that's created that affects my mood, that affects my readiness to receive whatever instruction there is as a student.
It's impacting you at a chemical level. Yes.
Okay. Even down to my grocery shopping. I'll probably spend more in the store with the better lighting. So that's really, really, really helpful. So tell me, and you mentioned it just briefly, tell me how disproportionate patterns in school environments. You talked about some of the schools where that is not, we have less than desirable conditions or aesthetics or impact on our brain. How can we manage those environments so that they don't feel as heavy, the chemicals aren't working against what we are trying to do so much in those buildings, which is invite kids to learn?
Okay. Disproportionate patterns are a second layer. So, okay, we were born to actually monitor people's face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. So that happens automatically. And whenever there's emotion in that, it impacts us chemically. And that's how we feel about that person. When it comes to disproportionate patterns, it goes to the fact that the brain, which also manages all of these emotions, which is also producing empathy, also seems to process patterns. And when patterns become obvious and consistent, this same automatic system in the back of your subconscious brain says, if these two things are together, why not put them together anyway? But it puts together so fast that we are sometimes unaware. So let's give you some concrete examples. The first example I'm going to give you is just an illustration. The second one's a concrete one that happened in our studies of schools. Okay, in the first example, it's a common one because it's happening all over the country. When No Child Left Behind came into being, one of the things that shifted in education is this focus on data-driven reevaluation of school progress. So imagine this school. It is predominantly white with a 10% low-income Hispanic population. It's actually a pretty good performing school. Now, the teachers get together every 2 weeks to check on the performance of students. There is a subgroup, the low-performing Hispanic kids, and the first 2 weeks, they're low-performing. Week 4, they were low-performing. Week 6, they're still low-performing. Week 12, they're low-performing. The teachers are meeting to figure out how can we help these kids, and that is their true desire. But the brain has found a disproportionate pattern. It's saying this group is low-performing. This group is low-performing. So what we know happens in the brain of most teachers is the minute they see a student from that subgroup, their subconscious brain associates it with low performance, which impacts their expectations and their behaviors. So now I'm going to give you a concrete illustration that's actually from our data. We have gone in there and done in-depth assessments of schools. And in a high school that we did, this high school is a large high school. It's broken down like this. It is 13% Black, 13% Asian, and the rest are white. It's actually a high academic performing school. We interview a high percentage of the students. We ask the students 2 questions. One of the questions is, are there good students in the school? Are there bad students in the school? The answer is always yes. Then we ask a weird question. The question goes like this: what does a good student look like? And in a school where there's no disproportionate patterns, the kids go, what? That's like anybody, dude. They look like we're crazy. However, in schools where there is a disproportionate pattern based on the environment, the kids always answer very quickly. In this school, when we said, what's a good student look like? 80% of the kids said Asian. And then they said this: that's not our opinion. That's our impressions of the teachers at the school. The kids had a name for it. It was called the Asian factor. And the kids said they perceived, based on the behaviors of the teachers, that the teachers of the school thought that kids who are Asian are good at science, math, music, and well-behaved. Now, let's understand this disproportionate pattern. Remember, you have hundreds of white students. Some are average, some are excellent, some are poor in academics. Some are average, some are excellent, some are poor in behavior. There is no disproportionate pattern there. There's a variation, so the brain can't figure out a pattern. But in this case, 13% of the population is overrepresented in honors classes, especially in the science and math classes. 13% of the population is overrepresented in the music program. And it's an award-winning music program. And 13% of the population over a 10-year review period was never represented in discipline. So if I walked down this school and I saw a classroom that had a high concentration of Asian students, I could assume it was an academic honors class. And if I checked, I'd be right. So that's one extreme of the thing. By the way, does it alter behaviors? Yes, it alters behaviors. I interviewed an Asian student, and the Asian student told me, when I asked him the questions, he said, didn't you hear about the Asian factor? And I played dumb. I said, no, tell me about it. He said, they believe all Asians are good at science and math, right? And so he goes, when I got here, I went to my first science class. I walked in and the teacher said to me, you're going to do great here. And he said, lady, I'm not one of those Asians. And so he gets his first test back. He gets a D. And she puts the test on his desk. He looks up at her and says, told you. She said, no, you'll be fine. He said he was leaving the class and she said to him, hey, what lunch period do you have? And he told her, she said, that's my planning period. Tell you what, hang out with your friends, but the last 10 minutes, come see me. And what she did 10 minutes every single day was tutor him for a few months. I said, how you did in class? He said, I got an A. She won't let him fail because the expectation was high. Now take the converse that happens in that school. Blacks represent 13% of the population. Black males had never represented more than 5% of the populations. When we asked students, what does a bad student look like? 90% of the students said Black males. Now, that 5% represented in 10-year review of discipline, never under 47% of discipline referrals. That 5% represented 66% of special education. And in this school, since it's a high-performing academic school, if you come in your freshman year and you start to struggle after a couple of weeks, they have these special intense remedial classes for English and math that they put you in. Well, guess what? It was significantly represented by Black males, to the point that if we're walking down the hallway and we saw a class with concentration of Black males, we could assume it was remedial and it'll be right. Now, understand patterns. That pattern is every time a teacher's walking down the hall, she sees everything. Now, what are the real life behavioral implications? There was an incident happened. And here's what the students said in all the interviews. Almost every student brought this up. They said, if an incident happens in the hallway, the hall monitors come running with their walkie-talkies. And if there's a Black males are in the hallway, they go to them immediately first. So here's an incident that happened. There was a gang of Black males who got into altercation with another group of students. Another Black male was walking by as the guys came. They grabbed them all. The students in the hallway said, no, he was just walking by. They didn't care. They grabbed them all. They took them all. They all got suspended. At the suspension, the kid said, I was just walking by, but he was a Black male. I was just walking by. They suspended him anyway. His mother is a teacher at the school. She goes crazy. And so she appeals. She does all this stuff. And after a 3-week appeal process, they expunge the expulsion. Now, he's a football star and an honor student. During this suspension period, he missed the football game. But here's the big catch. He used to love the school, the mom said. And here's what the mom said to us later. After the suspension, he stopped building relationships with teachers anymore. He spent his last 2 years saying, I hate this place. And he was disconnected from the community, and he looked at all the people differently. So there is true implications of this subconscious association that happens. So we tell schools, look for all your disproportionate patterns, and any of them that produce negative things, go deal with them. And the only way you can deal with them is to change the pattern. You can't coach it away. You have to change the pattern so people see a different pattern.
So it's what you described, I think, as a longtime educator, particularly in high minority schools, is something that's typical. And I certainly understand the impact of teacher perceptions and teacher expectations, because we behave according to those expectations. I'm intrigued by the teacher who said, come, 10 minutes, and I'm going to coach you through every day. But I'm not sure that experience, that opportunity would have been afforded to some other student who was not Asian.
Who didn't have the perception. And I think the perception stuff is so strong. When we did the review of the school, one of the things that was surprising to folks, that people got pissed off. So when we gave the data initially, people, don't want to hear that stuff. So the data found that most of the people at the school showed a subconscious bias towards Black males, which included Black teachers, which included Black female teachers. And we said that's based on behavior, and people got upset. But the reality is, you can have an association that your brain makes based on the pattern that's against your true values, but it still influences your behaviors. And so the people who are strong advocates for Black male students predominantly still behave the same in relation to their nonverbals, in relation to their behaviors in expectation, because the pattern is so strong. And once you're in an environment and your brain sees a pattern, the subconscious brain made the association without anybody thinking about it, to the point where Understand, when we looked at the number of hall monitors were 70% Black, but they were answering discipline things over and over again and saw a pattern. And once they established a pattern, their brain made assumptions. And if you interview any of the people, they would say, I have done nothing. I've just acted appropriately. They're right, because they're completely unaware that the pattern is there and influencing their thoughts and behaviors. When you learned about the science and accepted it, you could start to do something about it. And that's what we got certain teachers to do. They said, okay, we now believe the patterns, and they just started changing some things about their behaviors.
So the key then is, because in schools, in many schools, I'll say many, there are teams that examine data. In fact, there are requirements that you must examine your disproportionality. So that's a very intricate process. You not only collect the data, but you examine who's reporting it, what time of day, who's involved, what kind of infractions are, particularly around discipline, where we see that negative pattern being borne out. I think rarely do people actually examine who's in the gifted program or who's being selected for a particular highly valued programs. But let's just stick with discipline for a minute. When we typically in a school environment examine that data, we're hearing, okay, we have a disproportionate number of Black males or a disproportionate number of Hispanic males being excluded from school. We have a disproportionate number who are in school suspension, or a disproportionate number who is somehow disciplined for infractions. So you hear the data, but how do you actually get from hearing the data, processing it, and then changing, well, becoming aware of the behaviors that we're engaging in that cause that data to be? How do you get from that to actually recognizing that you need to change your behavior?
I think when you understand how the science works, so the disproportionate identification of Black males and Hispanics of color, and you have to say Hispanics of color because it's not Hispanics. What we say is that's not the disproportionate patterns that we see at school is not an outcome of school behavior per se. It's an outcome of societal behavior first, because those two patterns are existing in society. So if you look in society, you see an association of Black males and Hispanics of color to crime and violence. And how can I say that? Well, they've done a lot of research on subconscious brain association. Here's a cool one. They have people looking at a screen. They show the pictures at 30 milliseconds. You know, if you can't recognize something at 150 milliseconds, you sure as hell not be able to see it at 30 milliseconds, but your subconscious brain still does. So they show pictures. And when they show you a picture at 30 milliseconds, which you did not see consciously, then they ask what word comes to mind. So let me give you an example. They show a chocolate cake at 30 milliseconds. You saw nothing. They say, what word comes to mind? You might say something like dessert or hungry. Get the idea? Okay. Yes. In America, when they showed a Black face at 30 milliseconds, the three words that were commonly heard was crime, anger, and violence. And it was so disproportionately high that none of the other words made statistical significance. And that showed it was there constantly. This association has been there for a long time. It's automated. So if people have that association, it already starts to influence how the brain does it. So let's look at how it does it in real life. I come into school and I have this associations made by me by society, because society is constantly putting the two things together, that it's there from movies, it's there from books, it's there from everything I hear, it's there. I go to school. The moment I walk into the school, I have a thing called an amygdala, which is my emotional brain. Number one job of the amygdala is to keep me alive. I subconsciously already have identified Black males as associated with crime and violence. My microcircadian, remember that scanning thing of my eyes? One of the jobs of microcircades is to keep me alive. So microcircades walks me in a classroom and I see a bunch of students and I got 6 Black males. Here's what the research shows. My microcircades will monitor them more. The minute one of them acts out in a way that's threatening to me, my microcircades will jump in monitoring. We found it goes up to like 60% more than any other student in the classroom. So now I'm monitoring this dude 60% more than all the other students, subconsciously, not consciously, but that means I'm catching him more, which is reinforcing my belief that he acts out. But meanwhile, he's sitting there going, sometimes you're addressing me and the kid next to me is doing the same thing and you're not saying a word to him. So now the student's thinking, you're just out to get me. So it's going to make him angrier and make him act out more, which is going to validate my reaction. Now, when you talk to me privately and you ask me, is there anything you're doing to set the student off? My honest reaction is no, because there isn't. All of my monitoring is subconscious and his behaviors are true. So what happens if I understand the data? If I understand the data, my data goes, my brain is going to subconsciously monitor him more for negative things. Therefore, I have to consciously monitor him more for positive things because the brain does what's more reinforced. You reinforce negative, your brain gives you more. You reinforce positive, the brain gives you more. So I have to say, I accept that and I will change my behavior. But even before that, there's another change that we found significant. Remember that school that we said we went in there and did all this work and we said, hey, they had an Asian bias that's great, and we had a bias against Black males. After we showed them the data and after we showed them an experiment we did, we actually filmed student teacher conferences close up. And then we showed people in different departments the conference of teachers and students. And we had them rate how the conference, whether it was positive or negative, with the volume off. Then we turned the volume on and they heard what was said. Teachers at the school, who all said they had no bias, consistently said that when they saw the conference between this teacher and a Black male, they consistently rated it as a negative experience. And we turned on the volume, not a negative word was said. So here's what we told them. Remember, the first place your bias shows is subtle things with your face, your hands, your posture, your gestures, and tone of voice. When the volume was off, you saw it and felt it. When the volume was on, you just heard the words. That got teachers all being able to believe that was happening. So they said, what can we do about this? I said, well, one of the things that's really simple is change your face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice to be positive towards students because it'll improve your school environment. But go out of your way to make sure you do it with out-group members. Out-group members is a scientific term that says your brain perceives people who look like you different than people who don't look like you. So if we hook you under fMRI and we show you pictures, you see a face that looks like yours, guess what? Your amygdala doesn't have much reaction. However, when the face doesn't look like yours, your amygdala has higher reactions. That higher reactions alters how your face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice happens. There's another thing we found out about out-group members. We tend to look at out-group members less closely. So that impacts empathy because empathy comes from me looking at you. If I look at you less closely, my empathy will drop. So show you the power of just making sure you present well to everyone, especially out-group members. At this same school, a lot of teachers started doing exactly what we asked. They tried to present better to most kids most days. Everybody can have a bad day. And they really concentrated with out-group members. And a teacher emails me about a month into the experiment, and she goes, hey, been taking it to heart, been really doing it. I stand at my door, I say hello to all the students when they pass every period, and right after lunch, there's these two black boys that pass my class every single day, and I've smiled and said hello to them very closely. So she's been doing this for a month. So she said, these two guys were passing my class. And today I saw one of them and their face looked so distraught that I said, hey, what's going wrong? Are you okay? And the kid cursed her out. and so she says, I thought that was the end of it. And he came back after school and he said, I want to apologize. He said, here's what just happened with a teacher right before I passed you. And he told her, and she said, oh my God, I can see your reaction towards everybody after that. And he goes, I came back to apologize because you're always nice to me. You always smile. You always say hello every time I passed. Here's one. She said, two things happened. My behavior influenced his response to me, but the most important thing to her was she said, I don't think I would have noticed he was distraught because my level of observation wouldn't have been as high. So some of this stuff isn't as technical as people want to make it out to be. We have to consider that part of our job as educators is to take better control of our face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. Now, there are people who say you can't legislate emotions and people's emotions. Well, if we understand the science and how much it impacts our environment, yes, we can, because the minute teachers understand the science, the teachers themselves go, this is important. There's one, because I tell teachers, you're outnumbered. I mean, how many students? The only way teachers have an impact in school climate is if they're consistently doing things together. And so when we got teachers changing their attitudes towards people and making sure that they are outwardly positive consistently to everyone, what happens to the school climate is improves, and the students' attitudes also start to change. And we've seen it every time it happens. And here's the other thing we tell people. Do not reduce this to a thing of black and white. Outgroup members, anything that causes you some level of discomfort. So for some people, it can be a student with a disability. For some people, it can be a student who has sexual identity issues. For some people, it can be a person who's too anxious or too skinny or too not attractive enough. Whatever is outgrouped to you, your face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice will betray you unless you change your attitude. And here's the other thing we tell people that is important. You know that fake it till you make it? Fake it till you make it's kind of science. They researched, they found out if I start to project a more positive attitude towards people who do not look like me, then what seems to happen is this. The brain rewires, my amygdala activation towards outgroup goes down, and it becomes just who I am. And I'm here to tell you that's exactly what I did. And I've taken it to heart. And the quality of my life has changed because now I go any place in the world and I feel very much at home. And I don't require to see people who look like me anymore because my level of comfort is based on what I send out. And I think it's more important for us to understand these kinds of things because we're doing a lot of things to school climate. They're based on programs, but we fail to understand that programs are carried out by people, and people are carrying out a program based on signals. And it's sad to say that a lot of the signals that we're receiving in our brains, we don't know we're receiving, so we're not addressing it. And I think the problem with this whole issue of disproportionality, this whole issue of equity, is that a lot of people have done a lot of training on the causes, the outcomes of equity. Oh, you're suspending more Black males. And then we know that. But then you have to go back and tell people you're doing something to cause that. And most people are saying, I'm not doing anything to cause that. They're right and they're wrong. They're right when they're saying they're consciously not doing anything. They're wrong when they're not knowing that they're subconsciously doing something. But subconscious takes the blame out of it because subconscious tells us it's just how the brain processes, to the point of this. When we hook up, remember we have a societal bias that says we associate Black males to crime and violence. Well, when we show Black males, Black male faces, it has activation. But I look like them. I thought you said the brain doesn't activate because we look like. However, society is placed an association. that's caused my brain to be alerted. So if my brain is alerted when I see someone that looks like mine, it definitely isn't an issue of internal desire. It's an issue of a pattern that's so pervasive that the brain goes, let's put it together for you. The minute I understand that, then I'm willing to say, okay, I might be contributing to that issue of that over-identification, not consciously, but subconsciously. So what do you want me to do consciously to counteract that? I'm willing to do it. And that's where we have to start, rather than saying, well, here's the data, you're at fault. And that's what we've been doing, and people don't understand it.
And it works against us because we constantly almost beat people down once we get those reports because we simply don't understand how to correct it. I think you've really given us, well, you've shared with my colleagues what you and I discussed very intensely, but also in terms that we all understand the impact of society, our socialization, our kind of programming actually that we've experienced that dictates how we behave in social interactions, whether it's in an elevator or whether it's in a classroom or whether it's in a school. We behave the same way based on those signals that we've been given. And I think you've given us some really, I think, practical thoughts about controlling. Tell me what you said. We need to think about how we control our face, our hands, our posture. Tell me that phrase. I think that's the phrase I want to end on,
Face,
plus anything else.
hands,
Yeah.
face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. Face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. You know what's interesting? Like tone of voice, at 150 milliseconds, we determine emotion in a voice. That's the first thing we do. At 300 milliseconds, our brain determines things about who's talking, consciously and subconsciously. To show you how powerful that is, it changes how we hear people, because we found out if the emotion is negative and the person talking isn't attractive to you, you interpret what they say differently. And you don't even know you do it. And so it shows you how we even understand something as basic as language is daily influenced by this capacity of what happens to our brain. The minute someone's tonality changes, our brain changes how we process language. It goes in a completely different system. And it's already taken bad, because if the tonality is negative, I already have a attitude towards what's going to be said that's negative, and I will interpret the words differently. And I think people need to understand that language is based on empathy. We understand language based on empathy because we look at people when they talk, and that helps us understand if they're doing something tongue in cheek, if they're kidding, if they're sincere. So someone can say something very positive to me, and my empathy system knows that they're being sarcastic. If someone can be saying something somewhat sounding negative on the surface, and I can tell they're joking. So empathy is required for me to understand people appropriately. And empathy comes from how well do we monitor face, hands, posture, gestures, and tone of voice. And P.S., every superintendent out there should know empathy's been dropping for 40 years because it requires us to have face-to-face interactions and deal with emotions regularly. More and more kids are not dealing with emotions age appropriately and not having enough face-to-face interactions because our number one form of communication is texting. As a result, every social emotional learning, and I know that phrase is bad, so call it whatever you want, but schools need to be teaching how the brain produces empathy and its importance to our society, because if we lose empathy, we have lost the thing that has stopped us from wiping each other off the face of the earth.
Well said. I think it is clearly evident in what we're seeing more and more in terms of our students, but in terms of even adults in our society not being empathetic. I think this has been one of the most impactful lessons I've heard. And while we can talk abstractly, I think what you've given us today is a real fundamental understanding of why we behave the way we behave. And if we want to improve student achievement, then we have to have the kind of relationships, the kind of feelings evident, the kind of care and empathy that's necessary for students to be ready to learn, for us to be ready to teach, and for schools and districts to be places that are fertile for strong human growth and development. I so appreciate every conversation we have because I come away understanding more about me and who I am, but also I have great thoughts about what I could have done as an educator and how I can improve in my relationships with other people with whom I really want to have a positive growth experience. I can't thank you enough for breaking it down and making it easy to understand. I will invite all of our colleagues to take a look at not only your research. I'm intrigued now about the research that you've done, the study of the school. Everybody who's listening has heard a similar story without understanding it, of how some kids come into a building or some people come into a building and there are higher positive expectations for them. And those expectations are realized with help. And how some students or people come into a situation and there are no expectations for them, under expectations, or very poor expectations for them, and how they are also realized. It all comes to be based on what we expect. So I'll invite my colleagues to listen intently to this. I'll invite them to review your research. We will provide the resources for them in Canvas. If they're like me, they'll probably look at this recording more than once and play it back to hear you talk about it. And then we'll all go out and buy your new book on unlocking school bias, because it is the key to ensuring that schools are positive places for children to grow and develop. And that's really what it's all about. So on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you for your time today. And I want to ask you to consider making another appearance at some point to have another part of this conversation. So thank you. Any parting thoughts for today?
I have one. I think the issues, this topic of diversity and bias has gotten a negative rap. And I think it's got a negative rap because it deserves a negative rap. I think neuroscience and the science of how we can bring people together is one of understanding how all our brains work and what we can do about it. So to me, rather than it is a terrible lesson of blame, it is a wonderful lesson of how we operate and what we can do to help each other get over a lot of these issues. And it's so many of the steps we can take are simple, and all the steps start with each individual on a personal level accepting the science and making some moderate changes.
Well, thank you. And so I thank you for bringing that to our attention. I think what we're feeling right now, based on a number of issues, is a need for practical solutions that are based in an understanding of how we function as individuals, how our brains function. You help us understand that neuroscience can be understood. I think for many of us, we hear the term neuroscience and we think, oh, that's way beyond me. But you've made it so that we understand it. And what's really important, and I want to say this to you again, is that when you tell me about the number of industries that really rely on neuroscience, the fact that we don't understand it as much as we need to in education says that we should be committed to understanding it. And we appreciate people like you who've done the research in schools and help people see the value of it. We all want to understand how things work. And education, which is a human enterprise, it's really important for us to understand neuroscience. So thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for continuing to write about it. And thank you for being available to us. We appreciate it. All right.